Okay, great. Thanks, Jerry. And thanks, Bob, actually. His presentation really set the stage well for what I'm going to be talking about. My talk we'll be talking about how to live La Vida Mosa for 100 gig VPX systems. And the reason I say Bob's presentation did set the ground really well for mine is back in 2018 at this event, if we can go back pre-pandemic, that was 5 years, seems like 10. Curtiss-Wright actually presented some results of early simulations that showed that 100 gig could be done on copper connectors, which were released at the time, and actually newly announced copper connectors as well. So I'm stepping back a little bit in terms of technology land compared to Bob. Basically, if we fast forward to today, we've got 100 gig VPX systems are here to stay. We've got a lot of companies, not a lot, but quite a few companies have already announced 100 gig modules and systems and backplanes. So, really, what's there left to say, right? In terms of 100 gig VPX, it is pretty fast, but there are two things that I really want to talk about today, and those are optimization and interoperability for 100 gig VPX systems. So, but first, a quick history lesson. VPX started back in 2005 at pretty low speeds, 2.5 to 3.125 gigabaud per second per lane. And I'll make sure I say gigabaud for Greg Rocco's sake, who I don't see right now, but he's the one that taught us to use the right terminology when we talk about these speeds. Over the years, the protocol, the main protocol back then was serial rapid I/O. And we had others as well. And as those protocols released successive generations, and then we also considered and adopted new protocols, we continued to go up in speed, VPX Gen 2, VPX Gen 3, Zoom. When we got to Gen 3, we were talking about PCI Express at 8 gigabaud per second per lane, and 10 gig, 40 gig Ethernet at 10 gigabaud per second per lane. And then we reached VPX Gen 4 at 16 and VPX Gen 5 at 25, which are respectively PCI Express 4.0 and 100 gig KR4 for Ethernet. At that point, we kind of knew we needed to have an upgrade, actually, the VPX transmission channel specifically, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Really, we needed to upgrade it. So, to go with the car analogy or metaphor at the bottom, we needed a new engine and transmission for the 100 gig race car. Now, so here's the VPX transmission channel. Each of those speed bumps represents an impediment to the data movement from a transmitting BGA device on one VPX module to a receiving BGA device on another VPX module through that channel that you see there, through a couple of mated VPX connectors and a backplane. Of course, there's a lot more to it when you dig into the details. And those impediments are things like some of the things that Bob mentioned, things like insertion loss, return loss, crosstalk, skew of the differential signals. And for 100 gig, definitely each and every one of those needs to be flattened. And if you overlook even one of those, you have a very serious risk of not being able to operate your 100 gig VPX system successfully. In other words, you'll have a car wreck. I just love that Popular Mechanics GIF. One of the main pieces of the VPX channel is the connector. Again, to refer back to Bob's presentation, it was such a great ground setter for mine. The VPX connector has been obviously part of VPX since 2005. I mentioned the presentation that we had back in 2018 that showed that the copper connectors at the time were capable of doing 100 gig VPX. Although it was for quite short distances. Really, if you want to have any kind of margin and any kind of decent-sized VPX system, we needed a new connector, and those connectors came about in the form of VITA 46.30. And so really, to draw the analogy again, if you want to win an F1 race, you use the right tires. And those, here we have a couple of examples of those connectors, the TE connectivity RT3 on the left-hand side, and then the Amphenol Aerospace RVPX Evo 2. I hope I got that right, Amphenol people. And both of these connectors meet the VITA 46.30 standard, ANSI VITA 46.30, intended for 100 gig VPX systems and potentially beyond, actually. So speaking of potentially beyond, Jerry talked about a lot of study groups that are going on within the VITA group. At least a couple of those, at least 2 of the 6 that we've been working on are looking at next-gen VPX for things like PCI Express 5.0 at 32 gigabaud per second per lane. That's one of those NRZ protocols. And then Gen 7 would be 50 gigabaud per second per lane. That's for 200 gig Ethernet, and that gets into that PAM4 signaling that Bob was talking about. And we're even talking about 400 gig Ethernet at 100 gigabaud per second per lane, which is almost unthinkable. We thought, again, referring back to 2018, it was the last time we really talked in depth, I think, together. Well, maybe 2019 as well. But back then, we thought that 100 gig KR4, which I was talking about a few slides earlier, many in the industry, and I probably count myself among them, we really thought that optical interconnects and fiber would be required for those speeds. And here we are, firmly in the knowledge of 100 gig is definitely capable for decent-sized VPX systems over copper, and we're looking at doing up to 400 gigs. So I'm with Bob. I'm not sure that sliding 5-year window continues to slide to the right for me. Now, so the connectors are just one part of the puzzle. If we want to, MOSA is obviously firmly entrenched in the defense electronics industry. We've been talking about it almost ad nauseum, but it's certainly a key part of what we need to do and what we will continue to do. And one of the reasons it's so important is for interoperability. And if we want to be interoperable at these very high speeds, I can't think of a better way of doing it than the VITA 68 series of standards. VITA 68 was kicked off around the Gen 3 timeframe with VITA 68.1 for those speeds that you see there. And then the latest entrant is VITA 68.3, which is being chaired actually by Bob Sullivan, who's a signal integrity consultant to Curtiss-Wright. And we and I would say most of our competitors, I think almost all of our competitors, are firmly behind this and are strongly supporting it and sponsoring it. So let's look under the hood of VITA 68.3. I think this slide probably breaks a lot of the TED Talk rules, so my apologies for that. But let's do this. Let me try this mouse button up. Let's take is it working? Yes, it is, okay. Let's take a look at this top row, okay? Just focus on this top row for now, the one that says VITA 68.3 reference channel. Let's pretend that all those boxes are pieces of a well-tuned race car. And since it's 2023, let's consider an electric vehicle, so EV race car. Each one of those parts is very, obviously well-tuned if you want to win a race. Now, if you're a backplane supplier, so to come back to the VPX land and looking at this next, the second row, you need to make sure. So a backplane supplier, let's say that would be like analogous to the EV wiring system in an EV car. You need to make sure that when you put your backplane into that row, that it interoperates properly with the rest of the parts, such that the EV race car wins and the EV drive works really well. And then similarly, if you're a module supplier, those are the bottom 2 rows. you need to make sure that when you're at either end of the VPX transmission channel, you'll work properly in a 100 gig VPX system. So this is a really very brief overview. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about 68.3, but I just wanted to introduce it and and it's really, in my mind, a very good example of a modular open standards approach, or open systems approach is really what MOSA stands for. But I like standards as well in terms of what the S stands for. So digging into the details a little bit more, each of those blocks that we saw earlier in that slide can also be correlated to this diagram of the VPX channel. Each of those are a physical piece of the channel, and in this case, this is the footprint for one of the VPX connectors on the module side. Really, each one of those needs to be modeled. When you're designing a system, they need to be modeled in 3 dimensions, and in electromagnetic modeling tools such as ANSYS HFSS is probably the kind of the gold standard for this type of work. And then when you take that model, you solve it in a frequency domain, and you create something called S parameter characteristics. And then you take all of those S parameter characteristics for each of the pieces, and you concatenate or cascade or connect or whatever you want to call it, those together to form the VPX channel as a model. And that's really how VITA 68.3 creates those blocks that you saw earlier. So what's a good channel? What's a good transmit? The answer is not ESPN, by the way, although they do have good coverage of the F1 circuit, I'm told. I'm not a huge F1 fan, but I know there are a lot of you in here, right? Raise your hand if you're an F1 fan. Okay, yeah, that's about what I thought. So there's the figure of merit for 100 gig VPX is something called COM, or channel operating margin. And sorry to bore you with the equations, but basically it's relatively simple. It's the log of the overall signal to noise ratio. And the IEEE 802.3 Ethernet standard says that it needs to be 3 dB or better. Now that's for a physical channel that's measured. In the case of VITA 68.3, where we're simulating things, COM in our experience, so Curtiss-Wright has done some testing that I'll talk about in a few slides. It's been our experience that it needs to be at least half a dB better because of the differences between simulations and measurements and tested channels. So that's how we are attempting to define a good channel. So how do we put all this together? Again, this is a bit of an eye chart, but you know the first eye chart that you saw, if we swap in some actual, in this case we're Curtiss-Wright Fabric 100 simulated modules on either end of the VPX transmission channel, and we're in the 4 rows that you see in the table, those are representative of 2 of the worst cases in VITA 68.3, the so-called long lossy and medium long lossy channels. And you have all the other stuff in there, but in that case there, we're at these, you know, in both of those ends, we're at least a quarter of a dB better than that 3.5 dB target. And I must point out that those simulated models have a lot of worst case assumptions in them. So in actual applications, we expect this to be significantly better, but we wanted to make sure that we had a kind of a floor for operation. And you know, I've had a lot of customers ask me this over the last 5 years or so. Well, those are great. Simulations are nice, but how does that represent reality? How do you know that it's actually going to work? So we've gone through 2 rounds of testing in the last 3 years to show that will work, and we've validated that those will work through, you see a test setup there, and we've worked pretty closely with some of the connector vendors on these types of testing. And really that second bullet talks a lot about the correlation exercise that we did, where we discovered a lot of discrepancies between the 2. And those discoveries, we're going to share some of those in the VITA 68.3 face-to-face meeting this week, later on Wednesday. And we'll show some data, and that'll kind of validate why we're talking about that 3.5 dB target that I talked about earlier. The other thing that we'll be here for, that my partner in crime, John Ranovics, and I will be talking to the editors about, is that we'll be announcing this year a suite of our Fabric 100 technology 100 gig VPX products, and look forward to talking in more detail with the editors about that. And I promise that's the only plug I have, Jerry. We have to get something out of this, right? Okay, here's probably the most important slide in my deck. What does this all mean for the warfighter? Well, it's all about data centricity. I think anyone who's listened to the end customers, right? The DoD, the Army, the Marines, the Air Force. It's all about data centricity. And what that means is that the warfighter needs to have relevant data when they need it to make superior decisions. That's what I've boiled it to. That's my basic understanding. It's probably a lot, no, not probably, there's definitely a lot more to it than that. But really, what we can do with 100 gig, as well as a lot of other things like digital convergence, and then also the open standards, is those three things at least are combining to enable that kind of decision-making superiority. And that is how we live La Vida Mosa, in my opinion. Okay, I'm not going to read this. This summarizes all the slides that I've presented. That really brings me to the end of my talk. I hope it's been informative and at least mildly entertaining. If not, blame John. Okay, I'll open it up to Q&A at this point.
See that bus just drive by?
It was the race car.
Race car, yeah.